Hello and welcome to another Times Radio Frontline recap. Now, today we're going to look back at some of the interviews that we've done this week. And I've got a couple of little tasters as to what's happened this week before we get into that, as usual. But I'll encourage you to go and watch all of the interviews and watch the long form version, the full 20 minutes, 25-minute interviews, because they're all good. And it's the only way you're going to get a proper understanding of what's going on around the world with regard to the war in Ukraine. But before I get into the little snippets of interviews, I've got a couple of videos to set the context of what's been going on this week. The first one is Donald Trump talking about how the talks that Steve Witkoff had in Russia with Vladimir Putin went. Have a look at that here.
I don't know what the Kremlin's doing. I can tell you that they had a reasonably good meeting with President Putin. We're going to find out. It's a war that should have never been started. It's a war, if I were president, we had a rigged election. If I were president, that war would have never happened. It's a terrible thing. But I thought they had a very good meeting yesterday with President Putin. We'll see what happens. President Putin had a very good meeting yesterday with Jared Kushner and with Steve Witkoff. What comes out of that meeting, I can't tell you, because it does take two to tango. You know, Ukraine, I think we have something pretty well worked out with them. They're very satisfied, considering. But the sad part is, if I were president, no war would have ever happened. They would have had 100% of their territory. Nothing would have happened. It's a very sad situation. He would like to end the war. That was their impression. Now, whether or not, that was their impression. You know, their impression was that he would like to see the war ended. I think he'd like to get back to dealing a more normal life. I think he'd like to be trading with the United States of America, frankly, instead of, losing thousands of soldiers a week. But their impression was very strongly that he'd like to make a deal.
And Trump is saying that Witkoff talks went okay, but he's not sure what happens now. It's interesting that Witkoff was supposed to go back and debrief Zelensky. He didn't do that, or Zelensky's team, before going to see Trump. He went straight back to Trump. And Trump, I think, is sitting there waiting to see what else comes out of Moscow. Witkoff will have been played by Vladimir Putin. This happens, and therefore what I suspect we will see are a number of concessions coming out of the White House for Russia in the coming days. And I don't think we'll see Donald Trump hardening down on them until European leaders get re-engaged with Donald Trump, and then he's likely to harden his line again. But the next little video I'll point you at is Putin talking after his meeting with Witkoff, just before he goes off to India. Have a look at that here.
The issue here is that the pressure you've referred to typically involves employing political instruments to influence normal competition. Our energy cooperation with India remains unaffected by current conditions, fleeting political swings, or indeed the tragic events in Ukraine. Regarding hydrocarbons, well, before the Ukrainian situation, our business entities had already built a solid and efficient commercial relationship that is based on mutual trust. India has become one of the major refined product suppliers to Europe, not just because it buys our oil with a discount. It took years to achieve and is no way connected to the current economic environment. Certain actors clearly dislike India's growing role in international markets owing to its ties with Russia. Consequently, they're seeking means to constrain India's influence for political reasons by imposing artificial obstacles. Neither me nor Prime Minister Modi, despite certain external pressure we face, have ever, and I want to emphasise this, I want you to hear it, approached our collaboration to work against someone. President Trump has his own agenda, his own goals, whereas we focus on ours, not against anyone, but rather aimed at safeguarding our respective interests. India and Russia's interests. In our dealings, we cause no harm to others, and I believe that leaders from other countries should appreciate this. As for India's purchases or purchase of energy resources from Russia, well, I would like to note, and have already mentioned this publicly once, the US itself still buys nuclear fuel from us for its own nuclear power plants. That is also fuel, uranium, for the reactors operating in the United States. If the US has the right to buy our fuel, why shouldn't India have the same privilege? This question deserves thorough examination, and we stand ready to discuss it, including with President Trump. President Trump views his own policy, and he has advisors. His decisions aren't made out of thin air. He has advisors who believe that implementing such tariff policies involving the imposition of additional duties on trade partners ultimately benefits the US economy. He's acting in good faith, I presume. Our experts believe there are risks involved, but it is the choice of each country and its leadership to decide which economic policy to adopt. We have never engaged in such practices, do not do so now, and have no intention of doing so in the future. Our economy is open. We hope that, in the end, all violations of World Trade Organization regulations will be rectified.
And, Vladimir Putin is complaining about the unfair oil sanctions. But it's not just the unfair oil sanctions on Russia, it's the unfair oil sanctions on India. And he's clearly trying to set the conditions for his state visit to India. I find it fascinating to see Indra Modi of India and Vladimir Putin starting to cozy up a little bit more. Hopefully that will turn around and turn into the international community turning on India a little bit more. But of course, we've got the wider BRICS influence here, this other economic, I want to call it superpower. It's not a superpower. It's a conglomeration of different countries coming together to try and see what's in it for them and set up a rival economy to the US dollar around the world, or economic grouping to the EU. So it'll be interesting to see what Putin and Modi actually agree, if anything of significance, when the Indian visit is finished. So 3 little interviews I want to point you out this week. As I say, these are just snapshots from them. Go and watch the whole video because that's much better. First one is Maxim Tucker. And Maxim Tucker discussing the Russian negotiating tactics and how Putin doesn't let his negotiators make concessions. Have a look at that here.
You've got this fascinating insight in one of your recent reports into the political negotiating tactics of the Russians and the Ukrainians from a Ukrainian diplomat who took part in the Istanbul negotiations in May. It seems that many, as the talks go on right now, that you can get an insight from what he told you about what's happening at the moment.
Right. So the Russian attitude to the Ukrainians at the negotiating table is still that you don't exist as a nation, you're not real. And, they said that it's Sergei Kislitsa, he's the first deputy minister of foreign affairs, and he's been tasked with the negotiating track, the peace talks track. He's been in the room with the Americans recently as well and negotiating. You see his face pretty prominently in most of these discussions. And he told us about Istanbul and how the Russians opened with a kind of history speech, which set out how Russia and Ukraine was all one nation. It was a kind of contorted propaganda history speech. And then at the end, they said, so look, you see that we, the Russians, are killing Russians. We don't want that. And obviously speaking to a Ukrainian, a full kind of bench of Ukrainian generals, Ukrainian intelligence officers, Ukrainian diplomats, just denying straight off that they exist. And he said that they knew that they were prepared for that to happen, so they didn't engage with that at all. They just went straight to their agenda and trying to ensure that there was a ceasefire along the current lines of conflict. And the Russians simply would not agree to a ceasefire in any terms. The only thing that they would agree to is a few-hour truce to collect the dead.
And they went in with their eyes wide open. They wanted an unconditional ceasefire. They knew the Russian delegation would try show willing, but in reality offer nothing at all. I mean, did they feel then they had no choice but to go along with it, as you said right at the beginning, they're doing now?
I think absolutely. If the Americans think that there is a point to the Russians talking to the Ukrainians have no choice but to go along and go to those talks and show some kind of willingness to reach a deal, and then highlight the fact that the Russians are not willing to do it. And the one thing that Sergei Kislitsa said, which was very interesting, was that he could tell that it was pointless negotiating with these people because they had a diktat from Putin and they had no leeway to negotiate or change or discuss arguments. They just had a position that they had to stick to. And he said that they were also wary that the other people in the Russian delegation might report back on them. So all of them were trying to defend in the strongest possible way Putin's original position and not have any kind of compromise, which makes it obviously impossible to negotiate if you're not negotiating, if the person who makes all the decisions is not in the room.
And did you get to meet him in person, this man?
I met him first in Kiev. Yeah.
And how did he strike you?
Well, he was erudite. He was an interesting intellectual guy. I think he was very pragmatic. He was realistic about the chances of success. But he understood the importance of these talks. He also understood the Americans pretty well because he was the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN. He's been living in New York. And he is also the man who was responsible for kind of generating the initial wave of support for Ukraine in the UN after the initial invasion in 2022.
And Maxim gives fantastic insights, as to what Russia does, how they approach these negotiations, Putin's red lines, and emphasizes the level of control that Vladimir Putin has over the whole process, and the fact that those that are out there, the answer will have been pre-decided. So whenever the 28-point plan is put out and goes into negotiation, there's no freedom of maneuver whatsoever. And again, as Maxim highlights, that re-emphasizes the fact that Putin is not suing for peace. He's not trying to bring something that is going to bring an end to the conflict unless he gets everything that he wants. And that's the bottom line. That hasn't changed from way back in 2022, whenever Putin met the Ukrainian delegation in Istanbul, or Putin's delegation in Istanbul. They're going for maximalist requirements, and it's not going to change until Vladimir Putin is forced to do it. Donald Trump doesn't seem to see that. But then his interlocutor with Vladimir Putin is Steve Witkoff, and that's one of the flaws. Witkoff is being played by Putin, and Trump is being played by Putin, and that's being re-emphasized by Witkoff, who is being utilized, whether knowingly or unknowingly, as Putin's puppet. So lots more to play out in this, but it's certainly not going to go to peace. We then get into discussing more detail, and the next one I want to point you to is an interview that I did with Robert Fox, and he goes one level beyond the discussion with Maxim Tucker, and discusses how Putin actually does need an off-ramp from the war, but he hasn't been able to get that from the negotiations yet. And what Robert's emphasizing is the fact that Putin is beginning to hurt, and he knows that hurt will continue, but the off-ramp that Putin needs is something that will allow him to declare victory. However, anything that would allow Putin to declare some form of victory is going to be unacceptable to the Ukrainians. So we've got both sides at loggerheads, and there's no clear path to bring the two sides together. And that is the scary thing. But Robert, as ever, has got a lot of good historical analogies. He gives interesting examples as to where this fits in wider geopolitics, and in his inimitable way has got a very clear understanding of what's going on. So watch the snippet, but please go and watch the full interview because it is very good, and I always enjoy talking to Robert. There's not much he doesn't know.
Now, I want to go back to the 28-point plan, because why I said it isn't quite what Russia was demanding as appeared at first in the Istanbul talks, rambling talks that seemed to be on off. In April 22, I go back there, which Lavrov, as foreign minister, reproduced in the Alaska summit on the 15th. That is why it founded, because the Lavrov, that is the foreign ministry team, produced the talking points from Istanbul. It was in the press pack, apparently, in English translation, if you could find it. This is according to Foreign Policy magazine. And it would say, we want this and that. Now, why am I saying that the 28-point is, and I'm not being pedantic here, why it was different, it was his emphasis on deals, hydrocarbons, paying America, JVs, and Boulder's brass standing there, and particularly when you get somebody like Dmitriev involved with Witkoff, let's go exploit the Arctic together. As one of the 28 points is exploiting the Arctic together. And so it is a real estate ripoff. No, I shouldn't have said ripoff, but it really is. Now that leads to my point 3, if I could do it. What was so conspicuous about the body language and the play out from the 28 points was America negotiating and being the arbitrator, and with Donald J. Trump possibly being the chair, the president of a peace board. And he was arbitrating between Russia, not necessarily Ukraine so much as he was arbitrating against European NATO. So there you have the leading ally in NATO, and this is the crisis now. It is one of the biggest crises in the whole history of NATO, if not the biggest. You have the lead player saying, I'm not really part of it. And this is where they are ganging up, and I think that that's what's happened in the talks, where you don't have people like Lavrov or Medvedev or necessarily people like Boroshnik, the head of the FSB and of the security services. What you have is you have the money man, the new generations. You have Witkoff, who's always been around, Ushakov, the foreign affairs advisor, Hardman, and Dmitriev, against Kushner and Witkoff. This is a very odd way to do diplomacy, because they're not necessarily professional diplomats, almost any of them, with the exception of Ushakov. But certainly Dmitriev isn't. I mean, he's a carpetbagger who's partly Ukrainian, partly Russian, who's happens to have taken a few classes at Stanford and Harvard. So what I'm saying is that what is so conspicuous with the talks in Moscow, both before and after the event, is the hostility and fear, I would say, on the part of the Kremlin of Europe. Because what they are frightened of, and I think this is really pertinent to this whole conversation, is that Europe, in its sort of, we'll get the best solution last after we've exhausted all the other really bad ones, will get its act together, will arm, will confront NATO, and unless the sanctions are lifted, and unless the crisis in infrastructure, but above all energy, can be relieved, by this time next year, it could be such a crisis that Putin will be gone, which is a big thing to be made. So it is crisis and crunch. I think the weak point is Zelensky and Ukraine is in a terrible position. Of course, it's not only the scandal; they're exhausted. They're talking about let's give up. They're punch drunk on the front lines, and that is the weakness. And it's holding the line. Why they have to hold the line? Because it's no longer just about Ukraine. And I think that this is where the European governments, the Biden administration, can be held to account, because it is a confrontation between NATO, Europe, and NATO, which Putin always wanted it to be, and Russia now. And the cat's paw, the casus belli, the occasion, as it were, is Ukraine. And it may not be Ukraine for much longer. It could be the Baltics. It could even be the Balkans.
And then final interview I want to point you out today is with Tim Ash. And Tim is discussing the frozen Russian assets and the Russian economy overall. Have a look at that here.
Well, it's a very interesting one. I mean, I can see why Putin wants to do it, right? Putin wants to suggest he's got options, and obviously the American pressure on India, and obviously we had the Lukoil Rosneft sanctions. He wants to portray an image of strength, and that Russia is not going to be pushed around by the Americans or the Europeans. I think for Modi also, it's kind of interesting. I mean, that could irritate the Americans. Obviously the Modi-Trump relationship's been kind of a difficult one, or, obviously the tariffs were pretty painful. Again, maybe Modi also thinks that, playing hard to get, showing that he has options, etc. That's a risk. I think a bigger risk for Modi. Putin, pretty desperate. He needs to really show that he's got friends elsewhere in the world. But I think for Modi, he's taken a bit of a risk, I would think, here on Trump's ego, right? How will Trump react to this? Maybe not very well.
And how crucial actually are Indian exports to the Russian economy at this point?
Well, it's not the exports. It's, Russia needs the revenues, the oil export revenues. India, historically, India wasn't a big importer of Russian energy, but when we had the oil price cap and Western sanctions and obviously the diversion of oil away from Europe elsewhere in the world, India picked that up, and actually it was a big beneficiary. Got a lot of cut price Russian oil, big win for the Indian economy, saved them tens of billions of dollars. But then obviously the Trump administration cited that as one of the reasons why it levied pretty hefty tariffs on India. The message was you need to move away from Russia. And now obviously Modi is doing the opposite of that. I mean, Modi is signaling, I think, not only that he wants to continue to buy Russian energy, but he's also talking about buying Russian weapons. I mean, that's again a pretty aggressive stance from the Indian side. I mean, I guess I'm not sure that's a very clever response from India particularly. I mean, one big lesson from the war in Ukraine is what Russian variant kit has underperformed. I mean, NATO, US standard has excelled in this war, right? So, and obviously India has its issues both with China and with Pakistan. Obviously it wants to buy defense kit, but I'm not sure Russia is a great place to be buying it from at this point in time.
And does the US and Ukraine's other Western allies, do they have the power to kind of stop this from going on? Are they in a place to put sanctions or anything like that on India, or is that not really an option at this point?
No, I mean, I think it is. I mean, I think the US have signaled they could well do that. And actually Indian companies, some of the companies that have been importing Russian oil have been signaling that they are looking to move away from it. So it's kind of a little bit strange that we now have this very high profile meeting with the two leaders kind of saying, or certainly Modi saying something quite different. I don't know how that will go down in the White House or particularly in Europe, actually.
Yeah, and what is the state of Russia's energy export industry at the moment as well? I mean, it has taken a dip, not just because of sanctions, but because of this ongoing Ukrainian deep strike campaign.
Yeah, look, as we've discussed in some detail, I mean, look, in the period, in the run-up to just after the full-scale invasion, global markets were shocked by what happened. Oil prices increased significantly. Russia was a big beneficiary. We saw a big spike in export revenues to Russia from oil and energy, and actually then sanctions are beginning to bite, right? And also global energy prices have moderated, right? I mean, oil's $60 a barrel thereabouts, and then we had the Trump administration came in. They obviously the Rosneft Lukoil sanctions, etc. And then a reduced oil price cap from the Europeans. We're now seeing Urals trading at a significant discount to Brent, etc. So the Russians are now struggling, actually. I mean, I think they are beginning to get into a bit of difficulty. A significant drop in oil and energy and commodity export revenues in general. I mean, that's good news for those who want to make sure Russia has less resources to feed it to its the rebuild of its military industrial complex. I mean, my sense is, the Russian economy is increasingly vulnerable. Yeah, I mean, it's been very durable for almost 3-4 years of the war, but there are just signs that wheels are, could well be coming off, and it's a great time, I think, now for the West to push on with its advantage and tighten sanctions, focus on secondary sanctions. Again, that reduction in the oil price cap was pretty significant. And I think, in response to, the India-Putin meeting and the Indian suggestion or Modi's suggestion that they want to buy energy long term, again, I think the West should signal that that's a mistake from the Modi administration and that its companies in India are at risk of secondary sanctions. Obviously, there's been frustration around the peace process. Putin doesn't seem very serious about it. Looks like he's playing for a long war. We need to increase the costs to Putin of that war, both in terms of increasing military supplies to the Ukrainians, so increase the cost on the battlefield to Russia, but at the same time, tighten the screws around the Russian economy, right? I mean, this year, inflation is high. The Russian economy is close to recession, very little growth. As I mentioned, export revenues from oil and commodities are reducing. That puts pressure on the balance of payments and also on the fiscal position. So, we need to, Putin says it. He thinks he's at war with us, right? We need to take advantage of the vulnerabilities as they present themselves from him. And we need to, double up on sanctions and secondary sanctions, etc.
And Tim's going into the assets and exploring the reasons why those assets haven't been unfrozen, the political difficulties there are in Belgium, the assurances that the Belgian government needs from the wider EU, and everything else. This was recorded before the British government said that it was going to unfreeze $80 billion worth of Russian assets held in the City of London. But that was on the back of a report coming out into the death of Dawn Sturgis, who was murdered by Novichok that her boyfriend Charlie Riley had found discarded in Salisbury. That Novichok had been used in an assassination attempt against the former Russian spy Sergei Skripal, who had been resettled into Salisbury in the UK back in 2018. The inquiry into that concluded yesterday, and that inquiry put the blame firmly at Vladimir Putin, and the British government has used that as the excuse to unfreeze these assets. Let's see the impact that has on the war with Russia. But hopefully that may act as a stimulant for other European nations to give Belgium the assurances that it needs, that it's not going to have problems in the future, and release the $300 billion of Russian assets that are frozen in Belgian banks. So we'll see what comes from there. The Russian economy, as Tim discusses, is not in a good position, and the sanctions that the Ukrainians are imposing on the Russian economy through attacking its oil infrastructure are beginning to bite. So that's all we have today for the recap. Please go and watch all of the long form videos. But if you want to be able to get access to our videos early and to put question and answers for me to deal with in our Q&A sessions, please sign up for Times Radio membership. And of course, you can get us on your favorite podcast channel. Just search for Times Radio Frontline. Thank you. Goodbye.